Hey squad, welcome back to Character Rehab, where I take a character who's been misrepresented by the fans, the adaptations, or pop culture in general, and try to reconstruct what Tolkien wrote about them. Today I'll be taking a look at Elrond, who is probably my single favorite character in all of Middle-earth. So of course I've been eagerly planning this video for a long time, however I realized that for many people, dedicating an entire video to different portrayals of his character might seem like an odd choice. It's not that people don't think Elrond is important. He's an iconic character and tends to be prominently represented in filmed adaptations, even the very abridged ones, and in games, radio plays, and parodies. It's also not the case that he's been dramatically maligned. Barring some quibbles about the nature of his involvement in his daughter's engagement, most people have a generally positive impression of him. It's more that, at least at first glance, there doesn't seem to be much more to Elrond than the roles he plays in the main narratives, roles that are mainly supportive and, therefore, by definition, a bit limited. It is well known by both the characters and the readers that Elrond is an elf lord of great power and nobility. In The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, he represents a link to the distant legendary past. As one of the half-elven, he is the son of Elwing and Eärendil, and a descendant of Beren and Luthien, among several other notable figures. This association means that his character naturally takes on a more passive role in tales centered on the events of the late Third Age. In one letter, Tolkien noted, Elrond symbolizes throughout the ancient wisdom, and his house represents lore, the preservation in reverent memory of all tradition concerning the good, wise, and beautiful. It is not a scene of action, but of reflection. Thus, it is a place visited on the way to all deeds or adventures. This puts Elrond firmly in the role of experienced, hospitable mentor, a role in which, by all accounts, he excels. But this very suitability to a defined role lessens the impact of his major observable character traits. His kindness, strength, acceptance, and wisdom, although justly renowned among all peoples, are also exactly what one would expect from the Lord of Rivendell. Another byproduct of his symbolic role is that he never really gets to be a protagonist, even during the most colorful episodes of his early life. Elrond is the descendant of legendary figures, but not himself the main subject of any legends. His brother Elros's choice to sail to Númenor, found a civilization, and then accept the gift of men is contrasted with Elrond's decision to not do that. He's present at the climactic battle that ends the War of the Last Alliance, but doesn't actually get to suplex Sauron himself, nor for that matter is he the one who ends up making the important decisions about the ring. And by the start of the Third Age, the wiser elves, which certainly includes Elrond, have realized that the time of their active participation in Middle-earth's history is waning. The closest we get to a story centered on Elrond is in the tale of Aragorn and Arwen, but even here his illustrious lineage determines how his involvement will be framed. This story is arguably the culmination of Elrond's role as the bridge between the Elder Days and the Age of Men, a role that is now made literal since when Aragorn makes Arwen his queen, as Arwen's father, Elrond is the individual who physically connects the genes of the First Age to the newly established mortal dynasty of the Fourth. As fitting as it is thematically that Aragorn and Arwen's story should mirror the legend of Beren and Luthien, it means Elrond almost has to play the part of Thingol, the disapproving father who sets nigh insurmountable obstacles to the fulfillment of true love. Even a cursory reading of The Tale of Aragorn and Arwen shows that for all parties the story is quite a bit more complicated than that, but laying aside nuance, it's emblematic of Elrond's position in the larger legendarium that even in the tale centered on the link to the past that he uniquely represents, Elrond lands not just in the antagonistic role, but again in a supporting one, this time acting as both mentor and foil to both the young lovers. It's therefore all too easy for the character of Elrond to be obscured by his various important but narrowly defined roles. As Tolkien observed, to a degree this is unavoidable given the nature of the stories and their setting. Writing about The Hobbit, he noted, Elrond is an important character, though his reverence, high powers, and lineage are toned down and not revealed in full. For in effect, The Hobbit is a study of simple ordinary man, neither artistic nor noble and heroic, against a high setting. While this simplification may be necessary in the context of the novels as a whole, I don't think it means we should overlook Elrond entirely. There are many supporting characters who could be described as noble, wise, powerful, and compassionate to varying degrees, who have some symbolic connection to a vanished age, and who offer refuge, information, and assistance to members of the Fellowship at different points along their journey. Off the top of my head, I could list Tom Bombadil, Galadriel, Treebeard, Theoden, and Faramir as examples. Yet, despite their shared traits and narrative functions, these are all obviously distinct characters, and I think most people would agree that carefully examining the subtleties of their personalities is worthwhile and rewarding. If there really were nothing more to Elrond than Middle-earth's top-rated Airbnb host, it might not make sense to extend the same scrutiny to him, but as it turns out, there's much more to Elrond than just his reputation and genealogy. Describing Elrond as wise is accurate, but also an understatement. The breadth of his knowledge borders on the laughable. Characters who are themselves well supplied with their own wisdom invoke him as an authority on everything from healing techniques to the history of the rings to the precise wording of the original Lay of Leithian. And it's not just elven matters he's acquainted with, but mannish and even dwarven ones. He safeguards the heirlooms of the line of Isildur, and he can identify the moon runes on Thror's map. Moreover, Elrond has a reputation for giving wise counsel even in distant lands like Erebor and Gondor. The famous Council of Elrond was not actually planned by Elrond at all. Rather, it was the product of so many people from different lands all urgently arriving to ask Elrond's advice all at the same time. Boromir can't even find anyone who knows if Imladris still exists, much less how to find it, but even in Gondor it is still apparently said that the might of Elrond is in wisdom, not in weapons. While it's not surprising that Elrond, an elf lord of tremendous experience, should be wise, it's very surprising that he should be so widely known for his willingness to share relevant wisdom. As Frodo pointedly tells Gildor, the unhelpfulness of seeking advice from elves is actually proverbial, and far from denying this, Gildor defends it. Elves seldom give unguarded advice, for advice is a dangerous gift, even from the wise to the wise, and all courses may run ill. The elves have their own labor and their own sorrows, and they are little concerned with the ways of hobbits, or of any other creatures upon Earth. Our paths cross theirs seldom. This has been the case since the end of the Second Age. The fabled last alliance of elves and men is famous for being the last of its kind for a reason. And yet, for the past 3,000 years, Elrond has continued working closely with the Northern Dunedain, even sending forces to support them in their wars against Angmar, and personally fostering generations of their heirs after the collapse of Arnor. His own sons spend a lot of time riding out with the Rangers, and in the War of the Ring they actually come south with the Grey Company, bringing Aragorn more good advice from Dad. Beyond this alliance with the Dunedain, Elrond has a policy of hospitality and aid to all manner of travelers. In the final years of the Third Age, Rivendell, like all realms, must be well hidden from evil things, but it is accessible in a way the entirely secluded enclaves of Mirkwood and Lorien are not. Just as Elrond is famous for his wisdom, so is Rivendell renowned for its hospitality. In The Hobbit, it is recorded that his house was perfect, whether you liked food, or sleep, or work, or storytelling, or singing, or just sitting and thinking best, or a pleasant mixture of them all. All of them, the ponies as well, grew refreshed and strong in a few days there. Their clothes were mended as well as their bruises, their tempers, and their hopes. Their bags were filled with food and provisions, light to carry but strong to bring them over the mountain passes. Their plans were improved with the best advice. Bilbo eventually chooses Rivendell for his retirement, and he seems confident that all he needs to do is show up and announce he'll be staying indefinitely. Honestly, that seems to have worked out for him. As soon as Frodo recovers from his wraith wound, the whole household immediately starts preparations for a celebratory feast. Sam, Merry, and Pippin are made guests of honor, and Frodo is not only seated at the high table, but he had a suitable chair and was raised upon several cushions. Other realms and characters display hospitality, of course. The Rohirrim offer guests a ceremonial farewell drink, the Marchwardens of Lothlorien let the Fellowship spend the night safely up in the Talons while they decide whether to let them go further. Even Denethor has chairs and snacks brought for Gandalf and Pippin. But Rivendell is designed to accommodate the needs and preferences of all kinds of guests, down to the smallest details. Elrond might not be personally involved in every nice thing his guests experience, but Rivendell is his house after all, so he must be one of the forces responsible for making it as welcoming as possible. This exacting attention to others' comfort also shows up in Elrond's special prowess in healing. As a lore master descended from Melian the Maya, who wields one of the elven rings, it's natural that Elrond should excel in medicine, but the way he heals Frodo, for example, isn't with a blast of magic power or an ancient technique, but by carefully tending him for 4 days and 3 nights until he can locate and remove the Morgul Shard. After Frodo starts to improve, Elrond warns Gandalf against worrying him with too much news and talk, even though it's hard to imagine a situation where discussion could be more urgently called for, since the fate of the world is on the line here. Another manifestation of Elrond's kindness is his approachability. Thranduil is occasionally hot-tempered and forbidding, and even in her most grounded moments, Galadriel can be unearthly and even unnerving. By comparison, Elrond is downright easygoing. Bilbo isn't afraid to level a decent amount of sass in his direction when Elrond wakes him after the feast. "Wake up indeed," he said, cocking an eye at Elrond. "Wake up? I was not asleep, Master Elrond. If you want to know, you have all come out from your feast too soon, and you have disturbed me, in the middle of making up a song." This is much less the proper mode of address for an elf lord of unfathomable age and prestige, and closer how you'd talk to a trusted friend who's not afraid to engage in banter. Elrond is frequently noted to be smiling or even laughing, and despite having only a handful of lines in the books, he gets a couple of good quips in himself. During his very important council, he tells Bilbo, "If you have not yet cast your story into verse, you may tell it in plain words. The briefer, the sooner shall you be refreshed." And while he's probably not the sort to be singing tra-la-la-lolly and making snide comments about dwarven beards himself, we ought to remember that he does at least tolerate this sort of shenanigans from the people he lives with. In analyzing Elrond, we find ourselves paradoxically at risk of overlooking his most pronounced character traits because of how famous he is for them. He's extraordinarily wise, witty, and welcoming, but none of our narrators are much surprised to observe this because, well, of course he's that way. Everyone knows Elrond's just like that, after all. As well as living up to his reputation, Elrond demonstrates 2 other important traits worth noting. The first is the considerable mismatch between his observable personality and the tremendous amount of violence, loss, and disappointment he's experienced in his nearly 7,000 years of life. I mentioned earlier how Elrond's role as a surviving witness to the great events of the distant past means that while he's involved in historic events, he generally ends up cast in a supporting role almost by necessity. This being Tolkien, it should come as no surprise that most of the stories in which Elrond was a secondary character end in doom or tragedy of one kind or another. He's endured painful separations from his parents, his oath-bedeviled primary caregiver, his only brother, the king he served closely for 3 millennia, his wife, and all the now-deceased mortals he's made a point of aiding and befriending over the years. At least one of his children is seriously considering a choice that will result in the same severance. His childhood home on the River Sirion was wrecked in the Third Kinslaying. The very continent he was born on sank into the sea during the War of Wrath. He witnessed the ruin of Eregion and the dwindling of Lindon. He has seen Sauron's treachery and cruelty up close, and he's watched successive generations of his brother's descendants squander Numenor's legacy. One could excuse him for being mistrustful or even just a touch bitter after all this suffering. And yet he continues to pursue, as far as is possible, an active participation in the broader affairs of Middle-earth that's based on trust, cooperation, and hospitality. Admittedly, the mismatch between Elrond's magnanimity and his ludicrously angst-ridden past is probably partly accidental, given that many of the details of his history were solidified after he'd already appeared as a friendly character in The Hobbit. But insofar as it is an accident, it's a fortunate one, since it adds nuance and depth to a character whose appearances in the text are limited. Elrond is far from naive. His persistent kindness therefore seems much more the result of a conscious choice. The second thing it's important to recognize is that despite his unelvish willingness to advise and counsel, Elrond seems almost allergic to coercing anyone into a decision, no matter how deeply he may disagree with their choices. This is a trait generally shared by the wise. Galadriel and Gandalf show a similar reluctance to interfere with the choices of others, but Elrond really gets more, opportunities to practice this skill than anyone else. As early as his appearance in The Hobbit, he's placed in the position of helping Thorin's company despite doubting the wisdom of their quest. He points out obstacles to the romance between Aragorn and Arwen, but doesn't actively prevent them from pursuing it. He tries to persuade Isildur to destroy the ring, but doesn't attempt any leverage or retaliation when Isildur decides to keep it, and since Elrond was harboring Isildur's wife and youngest son at the time, he was certainly in a position to put some pressure on him simply by withdrawing his aid. Even though he personally seems convinced that Frodo is destined to take the ring to Mount Doom, he lets the silence at the council stretch uncomfortably long rather than hint at that conviction, to allow Frodo to make the decision himself. "If I understand aright all that I have heard," he said, "I think that this task is appointed for you, Frodo, and that if you do not find a way, no one will. But it is a heavy burden, so heavy that none could lay it on another. I do not lay it on you. But if you take it freely, I will say that your choice is right." He also makes a point of telling the rest of the Fellowship that they are under no obligation to accompany Frodo for any longer than they choose. When Gimli suggests that maybe something more binding is appropriate to the occasion, Elrond replies that since none of them can possibly know what they're getting into, they shouldn't be forced to make a commitment they might end up unable to keep. Many readers have suggested that Elrond's close personal association with the catastrophic effects of binding oaths are detectable in this stance, and I admit that is a compelling reading. But regardless of its cause, this tendency is pronounced enough that it again suggests intentionality. Certainly, Elrond would not be oblivious to the fact that his advice, so famous for its wisdom and so frequently sought, could be very influential. But one of the central tenets of The Lord of the Rings is that exerting influence over others can lead down a ruinous path of corruption. Gandalf and Galadriel both make the point that if they were to use the ring's power to pursue their own basically beneficent goals, they would eventually end up as sinister and debased as Sauron himself. Due to his influential status, as well as the borrowed authority of his illustrious ancestors, Elrond apparently needed to develop some caution about wielding the same kind of corruptive, undue influence, not only through the power of rings, but through his own position of honor. Elrond's literary character, then, can't simply be reduced to his role in the narrative. It's not just that he's particularly noble, wise, and compassionate. He's shown these virtues so often and so thoroughly in his dealings with others that his very name has practically become synonymous with them. The slightest bit of reflection on the numerous recorded adversities he's faced suggests that he's put some conscious effort into cultivating these traits rather than becoming embittered or cold-hearted. Finally, he also seems to have enough self-awareness to take care lest his advice and aid themselves become a means of controlling others. Now, while I think all these characteristics are well supported by the main texts, expecting an adaptation to somehow cram in so much nuance is not very realistic. The process of adaptation necessarily involves changes, including decisions about which aspects of the original to emphasize, which to amend, and which to omit. Tolkien's works are somewhat infamous for their expansive casts and complex plots, so generally speaking, allotting Elrond enough screen time to illustrate every subtle element of his character might not be a good artistic choice. Even so, it's still possible to evaluate which adaptive choices were successful and which were less so. Elrond being such a familiar character from Tolkien's works, as well as such a long-lived one, means that it's very common for him to be featured in all kinds of adaptations. Lacking the time and knowledge base to usefully discuss all of them, I have focused on 3 official English-language filmed Tolkien adaptations: Rankin-Bass's The Hobbit from 1977, the 1978 version of The Lord of the Rings, and the New Line trilogies of the early 2000s. I believe these are likely to be the most widely recognized and the most influential, not only on the public imagination, but on future adaptations. The most immediately observable, artistic choice across all of these is the character's visual design. On occasion, Tolkien's physical descriptions of his characters can be frustratingly vague. We still don't know poor Legolas's hair color, after all, but he goes into some depth on Elrond. The description from The Hobbit emphasizes the impressions his appearance gives rather than specific details. He was as noble and as fair in face as an elf lord, as strong as a warrior, as wise as a wizard, as venerable as a king of dwarves, and as kind as summer. In The Fellowship of the Ring, many of these same themes are repeated and expanded upon. The face of Elrond was ageless, neither old nor young, though in it was written the memory of many things both glad and sorrowful. His hair was dark as the shadows of twilight, and upon it was set a circlet of silver. His eyes were gray as a clear evening, and in them was a light like the light of stars. Venerable he seemed as a king crowned with many winters, and yet hale as a tried warrior in the fullness of his strength. He was the Lord of Rivendell and mighty among both elves and men. In case the passage itself doesn't hammer home the point, the context of this description is Elrond's appearance while seated between Glorfindel, who embodies the youthful exuberance of elves in the early days of Arda, and Gandalf, whose description here represents the wisdom of age without physical decay. Elrond is literally positioned between these two, embodying both physical vigor and ancient knowledge. The goal here, it seems to me, is not merely to create a detailed mental image, but to emphasize aspects of Elrond's character that might not be revealed otherwise. He's somewhere between old and young, an elf, but an elf still firmly engaged with the present moment, undiminished by age but bearing the marks of time. In fact, an elf whose appearance almost seems mannish, in the same way that certain humans from the same kindred suggest a certain elvishness. More concretely, he has the shadowy dark hair and piercing gray eyes characteristic of his line, traits shared by many of his Noldoran relations as well as by Luthien, and also seen in his daughter Arwen and many of the Dunedain, particularly Aragorn. To look at Elrond is to see the connection between the past and the future. Such economy is even more important in visual media, where time may be more limited, but paragraphs worth of information about a character's emotions, symbolism, history, and culture can be transmitted in a single image. In the 1977 Hobbit, we see an Elrond who seems both vigorous and venerable. The twinkly crown of stars around his head is certainly a choice. I suppose it's meant to visually signal his status and possibly his supernatural power. It might even be a reference to his name's meaning, Stardome, if we consider the dome in question to be his skull. In addition to a lovely beard, he seems to have silvery gray hair and some worry lines on his brow, which gives him a more aged, mortal appearance than would later be suggested. Assuming The Hobbit was the only source text for the film, this does make sense. The conception of Elrond, along with that of all of Middle-earth, changed significantly in the years between the publication of The Hobbit and the completion of The Lord of the Rings. Thus, in The Hobbit, Elrond is described almost as more a man with elven ancestry than the converse. So while it might not function as well in an adaptation of The Lord of the Rings, in this context his appearance works. While Elrond looks much more ethereal than the men of Lake Town, and he has those distinctive pointed ears, he looks far more human than the elves of Mirkwood. This isn't saying much, as I have pulled things out of my drains that look more human than Rankin-Bass's 1977 Wood Elves. But if you imagined a cross between someone like Bard and one of these leggy reptilian nightmares, you might conceivably end up with something kind of like Elrond. The most important suggestion here is not his specific genetic makeup, but the fact that Elrond is a character positioned between two extremes, something I think the film demonstrates successfully. In The Lord of the Rings, while the visual extravagance has been toned down, a similar principle applies. Elrond is shown as beardless and dark-haired, and he appears neither particularly old nor young. He's not glowing off the screen like overtly elfy characters such as Legolas and Galadriel do. His hair and clothes seem to remind people of a costume party version of a Roman senator, and given that most of the mortal or mortal-coated characters are stuck in some kind of medieval pastiche, that's actually not a bad comparison to evoke. Elrond is an anachronistic remnant of a realm that once united the entire continent. Its power now vanished, but its cultural legacy still strong. The degree to which this implication was intentional on the part of the filmmakers can never be fully determined, of course, but hey, if it works, it works. So far, we have seen Elrond's design straddling the line between human and elven. He's certainly not a mundane man, but neither does he seem exactly elvish. In the 2001 Fellowship of the Ring, there is a definite shift. Elrond is very elven. His very first appearance is at the head of Lindon's army in The Last Alliance, barking orders in Sindarin. His pointed ears, which despite limited textual support have become the preferred mark of non-humanity in fantasy generally, are on full display. He lovingly rolls the R's in Mordor and uses Sindarin in his private conversations. Overall, this depiction is probably the closest to what the text describes. For all his affiliation with men, Elrond did choose to be an elf, and he's lived as an elf for the past 6,000 or so years. One of my biggest nitpicks about this film trilogy is the degree to which all elves are lumped together visually, culturally, linguistically, and politically. I suppose it's understandable, but that doesn't mean I have to like it, and it does have consequences for characterization and world building, which we'll get into later. However, I will grudgingly admit that Elrond shows more of the effects of the passage of time than other elves do. For one thing, actor Hugo Weaving is around 10 years older than Cate Blanchett and 17 years older than Liv Tyler and Orlando Bloom. This gives him more gravitas, a more grounded appearance, and honestly more dad energy than other elves in the film. There's also those famous eyebrows, making him look comparatively careworn and even a bit world-weary. So while it's subtle, there are visual gestures to the idea that in some respects Elrond's relationship to history is more akin to a mortal one than might be expected. Unfortunately, when Weaving later reprised his role for the Hobbit films, the impacts of his relative age become somewhat blunted. Naturally, all the returning actors had continued to age at the usual rate before filming began on a prequel that was meant to be set some 60 years before their characters' first appearances in Fellowship of the Ring. Setting that aside, the character design itself is pretty consistent. And while there's a lot to criticize about the shifts in visual style between the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit trilogies, one thing I'd consider an improvement is that there's more visual distinctions among specific elven characters, and among the different elvish populations in general. Elrond looks more like the Lord of Rivendell and not just an elf lord. Plus, having Elrond appear in the same kind of crisscrossy armor shown on the elves during The Last Alliance is a neat way to remind the audience that this guy's been around the block more than a few times. Now that we've evaluated the kind of information conveyed by the visual design of the character in some of the high-profile adaptations, we can turn to the character's actual personality, or in the case of the animated adaptations at least, what little of it there is. In pretty much every case, his basic character is assumed to be relatively authoritative, wise, and if not outright kind, then at least benevolent. After all, these are the traits he is best known for, they are the most crucial to his narrative role of helpful mentor and provider of hospitality, and they seem to be dominant forces in his personality. So in the broad sense, all of these adaptations are as successful as they are interchangeable. The Hobbit film reproduces most of Elrond's dialogue from the book pretty faithfully, but since there's only a page or so of it to begin with, that's not saying very much. In the 1978 Lord of the Rings, the Council of Elrond is so compressed and chaotic that even people who are already familiar with the story might lose track of what's going on. But as far as Elrond is concerned, this compression makes his info-dumping seem high-handed and domineering. The conclusion to send the ring to Mordor does not emerge naturally after many hours of debate. Elrond just declares that it's the only possibility, and then yells at Boromir when he dares to question this admittedly foolhardy plan. Another minor point is that in this version, as in the book, Frodo is advised from the outset to head toward Rivendell to ask Elrond's advice. The 2001 film shows Frodo's journey mainly directed by the active pursuit of the Nazgul. When he leaves the Shire, his plan is to meet up with Gandalf and Bree. It's Aragorn who later decides to make for Rivendell. Obviously, this isn't a huge change, but the original version, which the older film retains, is another example of just how widely known Elrond and Rivendell are, and how natural a choice he is for anyone needing counsel and refuge. Even Sam recognizes Rivendell as a center of elven society. In the millennial Lord of the Rings films, we see a comparatively tremendous amount of Elrond, much more than we see of him in the novels. But while they take the fewest liberties in terms of their visual depiction, there are two significant shifts at play in the plot of the New Line Lord of the Rings trilogy where Elrond is concerned. The first, which I've already alluded to, is how strongly the film identifies Elrond with elves generally, holding him up as a representative specimen of what it means to be elvish, despite the fact that many of his important traits, attitudes, and decisions are surprising deviations from what an elf might be expected to do. More often than not, these intriguing qualities are minimized to make room for more stereotypically elvish ones. The other big change lies in the emerging centrality of Aragorn and Arwen's romance, which is now woven into the main plot. Setting aside for the moment my slavish devotion to hot single elf dads wearing velvet, there are definite benefits to this approach. Even Tolkien wished he could have devoted more space to their story, commenting, "I regard the tale of Arwen and Aragorn as the most important of the appendices. It is part of the essential story and is only placed so because it could not be worked into the main narrative without destroying its structure." The decision to spend more time showing this relationship also gives the characters space to develop the dynamic arcs that were so highly valued in the making of this particular adaptation. But even necessary changes can have unforeseen consequences. Some of the tweaks made to the story of Aragorn and Arwen create confusing implications about how elven longevity works. Some of the plot's most visible and logically questionable deviations from canon, like the arrival of a company of archers from Lothlorien at Helm's Deep and Elrond's own appearance in Rohan later on, are connected to this subplot. On top of that, the conflation of Elrond with all elves everywhere means that his personal anxieties about his daughter's unorthodox choices are now framed as a microcosm of the relationship between elves and men. There's plenty of possible reasons Elrond might have some mixed feelings about his daughter choosing a destiny that will irrevocably sunder them. But for the purposes of the films, Elrond's main flaw, the limiting belief he has to overcome, is his distrust of men. The film further suggests that this is rooted in Isildur's failure to destroy the ring at the end of the Second Age. Now, this is an attitude that some elves canonically hold, particularly after that whole business of the Battle of Unnumbered Tears back in the First Age. But this trilogy really loves to emphasize this idea as a major element in elven society, often to the exclusion of more subtle themes like the elves' own history of ambitious hubris and the ruin it left in its wake, or the multi-headed nature of the conflict with Sauron. While it's largely dramatized through Elrond's character evolution, this distorting emphasis bleeds into other characters' stories as well. Instead of holding a council in response to several simultaneous but independent requests for help, Elrond now somehow has the authority to summon people in an effort to spearhead a sort of global response to the threat of Mordor. Characters like Denethor and Boromir are suspicious that this is an effort made by the elves, conceived as a political and cultural monolith, to limit men's access to the ring and their influence over its fate. Moreover, they appear to believe that the elves are doing this because of an irrational prejudice against mankind that was based on isolated incidents from the distant past. The problem is, in this version of Middle-earth, such suspicions are justified. Even Aragorn is drawn into this dynamic. In the novel, he shows some understandable anxiety about his ability to successfully reclaim his throne and help defeat the forces of evil incarnate. In the films, he's shown to be a victim of what we might call internalized Adonphobia, doubting not just his ability, but his own worthiness to even make the attempt. But of course, it's Elrond who is most affected, since this concept of prejudicial distrust of men becomes the center of his whole emotional arc. This not only obscures, but outright contradicts some of his most distinctive traits, his unique heritage, and his particular dedication to working alongside men, in contrast to the majority of his more reserved elven kin. And on a more personal level, Elrond's seeming ability to hold a grudge against an entire people for 2,500 years makes him seem embittered, resentful, and even, dare I say, petty. Recall that in the book, even though Elrond does have ample cause to show such traits, his kindness has become axiomatic to the point where the characters scarcely consider it remarkable. It's not that the film's version doesn't make any sense, it does make sense. But ironically, one of the most impressive things about Elrond is that his commitment to radical compassion and hospitality doesn't make sense. He persists in it despite having every conceivable reason not to. These films are to be commended for showing Elrond's sincere affection for his daughter when they could easily have made him entirely unsympathetic. However, he also becomes quite manipulative in his efforts to terminate her relationship with Aragorn. Again, this is something Elrond is careful to avoid in the book, despite his position of authority. It also further supports the suggestion that men and dwarves are right to distrust the elves, whose main representatives in the films are either overtly dismissive or subtly duplicitous. There are several possible takeaways from this exploration, and two of them relate to the process of critiquing adaptations in general. First is the recognition that a particularly iconic or successful interpretation can often influence our understanding of a source text in ways that can be hard to consciously notice, and trying to identify and challenge these assumptions is a useful exercise. Second is the principle that all changes have consequences. In a cohesive story, all characters, even minor, limited, or flat ones, contribute to the story's subcreative framing, so dismissing certain changes out of hand as trivial is a perilous proposition. Even with necessary or good changes where the payoff is well worth the sacrifice, there's still something being sacrificed. Recognizing this exchange allows us to take a more rational approach in evaluating a given adaptation's success on its own terms. And finally, what Elrond specifically shows is that the darker and edgier interpretation is not always the most interesting one. A character with an unimaginably tragic backstory on the one hand, and an impeccable reputation for sincerity, decency, and generosity on the other, automatically generates a tension and a fascination that doesn't require a lot of conscious engineering to be compelling. Particularly in Middle-earth, where staggering horror and loss coexist with moments of breathtaking triumph and beauty, such characters should be noticed and valued. If you enjoyed this rabid fangirling over a character who never gets a chance to do anything, give the video a thumbs up. Each like will restore one tiny fragment of Elrond's shattered heart. If you made it to the end of this video, you are almost certainly in my target audience, so you might as well subscribe and sign up for notifications. Bonus content can be found on my Patreon, as well as some thoughts on Elrond's appearance in the Rings of Power show that I didn't have space to get into here. I've made that one publicly available, so you don't have to sign up to hear it, just follow the link. Shout out to the artist CK Goksoy, who does fantastic work generally, including this nifty portrait of Elrond I commissioned for this video. His links will also be highlighted in the description. Thank you to everyone for watching, especially my patrons, including Marcel Ribeiro, Nick Riallo, Chris Nichols, Jeremy Buckingham, Bitsobongo, Dorwin Gray, Emperor Kane, Allison Kreutzberg, Gandalf the Grey, John Love, Brendan Mooney, E. Rose B, Frankie 12-String, Louis Maskell, Tamara Saldana, Luke, Kevin Gilstad, Joel Bion, Rogue Hot Pocket, Karen and Michael Donahue, Elu Thickgoal, and Jared Carver.